Because what I hear over and over again from folks is that it's the silence that's deadly. That's what just really devastates people, is when there is no space at all to talk about it.
You're listening to the No Labels, No Limits podcast with best-selling author Sarah Box. We focus on the mantra, no labels, no limits, no excuses. And now, without further ado, please welcome your commanding coach with plenty of chutzpah and heart, Sarah Box.
Hey there, No Labels, No Limits podcast listeners. Welcome back. I'm Sarah Box, your host of the No Labels, No Limits podcast, where you all know we are on a mission to help individuals, teams, and organizations, especially our nonprofit friends, think outside the box, move beyond limiting beliefs, and create a profound impact in the lives of others, including their team members and themselves. And we do this by sharing accomplished and inspiring guests who have challenged limiting labels and beliefs. They've pursued and accomplished personal and professional goals, and so they show up on the podcast to share those experiences with you, with the goal of improving everybody's life. So today, I am thrilled to introduce to you a truly remarkable guest, Margo Fowkes. Margo is the founder and president of On Target Consulting, a firm specializing in helping organizations and individuals act strategically, improve performance, and achieve their business goals. Ooh, I like all of that. She's also the author of the award-winning book, Leading Through Loss, How to Navigate Grief at Work, where she coaches leaders on how to create a more compassionate culture by acknowledging and speaking openly about grief and loss in the workplace. And you might be surprised to know that Margo's dad was 60 years old when she was born, and he lived to be 102 and a half. So this is a unique aspect of her family, and it adds to the personal dimensions of her understanding of longevity, generational experiences, and possibly informs her compassionate approach to life and work. And I am going to ask Margo about that, because I find it in our culture today and how separate families can get, what the value of that is, what she feels she gained from having that. So anyway, and to challenge some of our assumptions about aging. So we're going to talk about that. I want to talk to her about her strategies for helping others navigate grief at work and how it's even defined, and supporting their colleagues. And we'll see where it goes. You know that sometimes we'll pull a thread and we'll go a totally different direction. Margo's all ready for that. So with that, let's officially welcome Margo to the No Labels, No Limits podcast. Hi, Margo.
Hi, Sarah. I'm so excited for our conversation, just because of the similarities in some of the work that we do and all the different directions that you may take us in this morning.
Yeah, me too. I had a day off. I read, which means I'm all fired up. For good or ill. I might get on a soapbox. We don't know. But Margo, you did share that your dad was 60 when you were born, and that he lived another 42 and a half years, which is impressive. So can you talk a little bit about how growing up with an older parent shaped your perspectives, both on life, longevity, and the way you approach your work?
It's such an interesting question, and it's one that I don't think I thought about until certainly long after I was grown up, and maybe not even really fully until after he died. My dad was always amazingly vibrant. When people met him, they knew that he was older, right? An older dad, particularly because I grew up in the generation where most parents were in their 20s. So even my mother, who turned 39 just after I was born, was considered an elderly parent, if you will, right? But my father didn't look his age, and he never acted his age. So he worked. He was a real estate developer with his own business, and he continued to work until he was just about 90. And at that point, he had an office in the house, but he'd only moved it there. I think he moved it there when he turned 87 or 88, something like that. But he showed me that when you really love what you do, there doesn't have to be an end point until you're ready to decide that you want one, right? He didn't want to retire. In some ways, he couldn't. I mean, he used to joke that I kept him young, and I think that's true. But I also think when you have a younger child and you have to get them through college and launch them into the world, you tend to work longer than you might if you hadn't had this kid at that age. But he really loved his work. And he was vibrant and interested in the world. And so he could shift from getting off a business call or reading the Wall Street Journal or, some document that he had to go over to hanging out with my son, Jimmy, at the age of like 3 or 4, who was explaining to him how Pokemon worked, right? And he was interested in everything. And so I grew up with that without thinking as much as you might think about how old he was, because it wasn't the age that he acted. He used to joke, in fact, when he had a birthday, that it was whatever anniversary of his 39th birthday. So he never got past 39. He just had anniversaries that came after that.
Well, it sounds also that his curiosity kept him engaged, which kept him thinking forward, not like, and the thing about retiring, it means it's like I retire from I disengage. To me, I have a mental negative connotation with the word retire, just because it's like, what are you retiring from? So it sounds like he didn't really quit. He just kept going and engaging.
I think that's true. And I think sometimes when we talk about retirement, the implication is I'm escaping from, I'm getting out of, I'm done with, right? And it isn't to say that there are a lot of people who leave one profession and retire, if you will, and then go on to something new, whether it's paid or unpaid, a passion project, whatever it is, where they have what we call a second career, if you will, right? But sometimes I think retirement does get a bad name because it's almost like you said, we're retiring from the world, we're disengaging, we're getting in our rocking chair, and, that's the end of it, sort of. And so Dad...
rocker is good. Yeah. I don't want to live in it. No, but I think you're right. And I know for me, that's the thing between people who own their own businesses, right? And if you really love what you're doing, it's like, well, it doesn't feel like work. It feels kind of like play. Yes, it's not like a play day all the time, right? Because you're doing business. But man, it feels so great if you can accomplish what you're setting out to do in your mission. So thanks for setting me straight with a little different perspective on that, Margo. But how else did growing up with your dad, the age difference, influence how you thought?
So my dad had always worked for himself, pretty much. He left college when he was 19, I believe, because his father got ill and he was called home to run the family business. And he did that for a period of time before then launching out on his own with his real estate development business. And that kind of went through different phases and different partnerships, but he, for the rest of his career, worked for himself. So after I had our first child, I decided that I wanted to start doing consulting work because I wanted some freedom and some ability to set my own schedule. My husband at the time was in a sales job, and as you probably remember, back in this would have been the early 90s. It was the kind of time where a client would call and say, or a customer, and say, hey, we need to have a meeting about X. And my husband would get on a plane, right? There was no Zoom. You wouldn't even take the call over the phone. It was, we need to see you in person for a 2-hour meeting. So please fly to Cleveland or wherever. So Dan traveled quite a bit and I needed to be home. So I launched my business. And I know that even though I didn't think about it, that was another influence of my dad, of feeling like, well, I could do this. I remember being a little worried about how I would get clients and how it would go and all of that. But it wasn't enough to stop me because my dad had done it. And so he gave me some advice and he shared his initial, his contract that he used when he was doing consulting work, and off I went. And I made plenty of mistakes and it was harder in some ways than I thought it would be and easier in others. But I realized that I had this underlying belief that I could do it. And then also when things got hard and I got in a sticky situation, I could call him and he would talk me off the ledge and kind of calibrate with that way that someone can when they're older of like, listen, I know you're upset that your colleague on this project is acting like a jerk or being really difficult or not doing the work that he was supposed to do. But it's okay. Like, this is not life altering. Take a deep breath. We'll navigate our way through it. And so that's another influence too, is that he'd been through enough stuff that he could calibrate what was a problem and what was an inconvenience, as they say.
Oh, that's such a great gift to give someone. I know for me, I find myself doing that more and more, whether it's in business or just in life, right? Someone goes, this is terrible. And I'm thinking, not really.
Yeah.
I'm sure it feels that way because it's new to you.
Right.
It's new to you, but it's not, it's not the end of the world. It's fixable, it's navigable. And may I offer you some suggestions, right, about how you might do it? Or if it's something really simple and technical, can I just share a tool with you that might help you through it? So that makes me wonder, that was your dad doing that for you. And you were in proximity to your dad. Okay. So then I think about in our family and other families I know and kids local and further apart, they're not necessarily that closely connected to family or older adults, especially maybe that much older, who can just sit with them and say, okay, let's look at this. Let me help you a little bit. So what impact, if any, do you think that has on just how younger generations coming into the workforce who might be at your dad's age as he was when he decided he needed to go out on his own at 19, how it would frame how they think and their confidence level?
I think it's challenging if you don't have that. I don't think you have to get it from a parent. I mean, I was really lucky that for both of my parents in different ways, I could call them about just about anything and get this kind of wise, calming advice about this too shall pass and we will figure this out, right? But at the same time, when I look back on my early career, I also found that in the people that I worked with. So there was always someone in the organization before I was out on my own that, whether they were a peer or someone who was older than I was, that I went to for some mentoring for different kinds of things. And so I think that it's important to find that, because we all make mistakes, right? So we're going to make mistakes anyway. It's the best way to learn. That's the bad news about this, is that we can't avoid them. But learning how to navigate them and learning how to process them, it's really hard to do on your own. It's practically impossible to do on your own. And if you're doing that only with peers, they only have mostly the same level and amount of experience as you do because they're the same age, right? They can only have so much more experience. So you really need someone who's older and more seasoned who can help you understand that, failure isn't fatal. You've made a mistake, here's what you can do to address it, fix it, or at least figure out how you're going to live with it, because maybe it's not correctable. And you're going to have to be okay with that too. But I really think it's important to find those older, wiser voices as you go.
Yeah. So where do you point people to for those? I mean, if it's not with it, we have a lot of people who work by themselves or they're remote working. So it's not as easy as like just walking down the hall and finding a seasoned colleague who may be older, been more tenured, and saying, hey, can I just run this past you? Right. It may be, but it likely is not. I just know so many people work remote and it's like it's harder to connect, even though we have Zoom and all that, right? Because people have more flexibility. They may be involved in other things, right? Like when you just need a few minutes. So how do you help folks get that in their work lives or think about it differently?
So sometimes, particularly in this kind of hybrid remote work that we're doing, right, which is, is really challenging to build community and culture for the individual, right? I think it's about getting out in the world and I'm biased, Sarah, you're going to laugh because you'll understand where I'm coming from in this, but I think one excellent way to do that is to get on the board of a nonprofit, because you are going to almost by definition meet a breadth of people and usually a range of ages. And I think it's a good way to interact with people where you're building some professional skills and getting to know them in a way that's productive and beneficial for your growth as a young professional, but also a way of really getting exposure to a breadth of people and perspectives that you might not get otherwise. And so I think you have to get out in the world a bit. And you can also volunteer. I mean, I think it can come also from that as well. But I think the fastest path to it really is to join a board of directors of a cause that you care about and want to get involved with.
Boy, I couldn't underscore the power of that more than that, because you can't have it your way. It's a board. It's different people. They're there because they're different, right? As an executive director, you don't want your board to be all the same, because then they're just a rubber stamp for you. And you need a board who can be your governing body, right? So you do want that breadth of perspectives. And nonprofits, for the most part, are looking for good board members who show up and do what their board is required and requested to do. So I think that is such a great example. And I've never had someone offer that up as a great way to do it. But getting out into the community and listening, for me, I am blown away by what our two of our grandsons talk about, because it's so advanced. It's not always grounded. I mean, it's like, okay, I'm going to do this, but I think and I'm thinking, well, it's not going to be that hard, because you guys, because you're this focused, you've already gone this far, right? But it is so great to hear, like, okay, good thinking, interesting thinking, or ask, so what are your friends talking about? I don't know if you want to hear that. Oh, I do.
Exactly.
Dude, I said, hey, can you recommend some music for me? He goes, well, I like jazz. I said, me too. And he goes, I don't know if you're going to like my jazz. I go, send me your links. I'll tell you what I think. It was mostly good. It was mostly, the music was really good. He said, the one thing you're not going to like are the lyrics. And I said, I won't pay attention to the lyrics. But you know what? I was so jazzed, no pun intended, to get his recommendations, because I thought, man, that's some talented musicians there.
Exactly. Well, and the other thing too is most boards, are in many cases are aging. The younger generation has a different approach to volunteer work. And, I grew up in a time when my parents gave to United Way, where it was just an expected thing that you gave back and you volunteered. You didn't have to sit on a board of directors, but you were involved in some way in the community in giving back. And for younger folks, they're carrying a lot. It's a much more expensive world. It's just different. But at the same time, what they sometimes don't realize is that boards are getting older, and many of them are eager and hungry to include the younger generation, so that if you show up, they want to hear from you, just like you were saying about your grandchildren, right? They want to know, what do you think about this? How do you look at our organization, this program, this approach? What do you think of this fundraiser, right? Because a lot of the same old playbook doesn't work anymore, and we need that younger voice.
It's boring, it's stale, exactly. It's fun, But okay, I'm going to do a little digression. So I mentioned to you before we hit record that I did a retreat a month ago. So in the downtime, it's an offsite, so it's a big house. We're all in the same place. So we're having meals, which are great times for folks to chat. But they're talking about their favorite musicians, right? Some music they really like. And I'm thinking, yeah, that's from the 1950s. I'm not saying a word, right? That's the 50s. And someone goes, so you know who Johnny Cash is, right? And I'm thinking, are you kidding me? These are like 20-year-olds, late 20s, right? Early 30s. And then all the way up to, it was a wide range of ages. But I'm just sitting there, and they're not first generation Americans. So it was so interesting. And I'm thinking, this is the coolest conversation.
Exactly.
So, but they are doing amazing things in their nonprofit as staff and outreach people. So that's a long way around the bus or the barn to say that I agree with the getting on boards, getting engaged with those, because there's so much energy, especially when you can lend generations.
Yeah, Absolutely. Absolutely. And the flip side of that too is, I've learned plenty from being on boards, not just working with them, but being on boards. And I've also made mistakes on some of the ones that I've joined, or where I've gotten to be somehow the leader of the board too soon. And they're more forgiving in this sense of, you get in a situation where it's not quite right, or you're not being heard or whatever. You can step down, hopefully at the end of your term, but if it's bad enough, you can go sooner. And there's a flexibility there that doesn't exist in the workplace. So that you can also, you have a right as a volunteer to be getting something out of this, and also to be treated well and with respect. And so there's lots of learning there going on that we don't necessarily think about as it's happening, only with hindsight, but it's really valuable too.
Boy, that's such a good reminder. And I will put myself out there. If you're considering getting on a board, and I'll put Margo out there, but she can decline. But honestly, if you think you're going to be on a board and you're not sure if it's a right fit for you, go on my website and grab 15 minutes with me, and I will talk about that with you, about why you want to be there, what you know about them and stuff. I'll help you at least find some questions to ask them if you're being asked to be on board. But trust your heart, do a little research. And I would encourage you to do it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I will match that, in that if anyone wants to reach out to me, I'm happy to do that too. I do some board trainings that are just about, like, how do you find the right board for you? The more fundamental question, how do you know you're ready and in the right place to go serve on a board? And if you are, how do you find one that's a good fit for you? Because otherwise and I've done this too, right? Where you get on a board because you like somebody who's on the board, or because they want you and you get excited, or because you care about the cause, but you don't really do your homework when it comes to the board and how they operate. And then you get on and it's not quite as much fun as you thought it would be.
Yeah, and it is okay to say, this wasn't my best decision at the moment, or could you help me with this? Sometimes we feel embarrassed about asking for help versus saying, I just need a mentor for the first 6 months to help me understand, to go through this. And there's all kinds of ways of doing it. So folks, if you're listening and if you're watching on YouTube, put a comment in YouTube about what you think about reaching out for help, getting help to get on a board, because I know Margo and I would both be interested in your thoughts and comments on that.
Absolutely.
And I'll share them back with Margo. So anyway, I want to shift gears a bit here, because, you've done a ton of work about bringing compassion into organizations, leaders, loss, and all of that. So I think where I'd like to start that conversation with you is the unaddressed or unacknowledged grief, and what toll that can take on us individually or as teams in a workplace, physical, mental. Like, what is the impact of that?
I think the impact is huge. And in this case, I think so much about the grief we carry that is not related to a death or, the loss of a human, right? Because we are so much better about using the terms grief and loss. Even if we don't handle it well in the workplace, we at least acknowledge it as such. But I started doing this work without knowing that I'd started doing this work back in the late 90s, when companies were using layoffs as a tool, very much like they are now, to kind of trim fat, cut costs, right size the organization, all the buzzwords that they use. And there were humans losing their jobs. And I'd worked a decade earlier, I'd worked for Unisys Corporation back in the mainframe computer days. And I'd survived 3 layoffs. And what I learned from surviving them is that while, yes, I still had a job, there's plenty of trauma that goes on when you are part of the survivors, because you have close friends that are no longer there. So the whole culture is cracked and upended by the elimination of 20-25% of the people who used to work with you. But also, like many companies, and Unisys wasn't unique or different in this, they didn't really acknowledge what had happened. There was a brief kind of, we're sorry to see these people go. Now let's get back to work. And if anything, there was a lot of emphasis and feeling of like, well, I got to be productive. because maybe I'll be next if don't jump back in and I'm not upbeat and I don't, kind of carry on the way that I'm supposed to carry on. So with that kind of perspective, I wound up doing some work in the late 90s with companies that were also laying off large swaths of people because there was a downturn and it was necessary. But the better companies locally were bringing me in to work with the surviving teams and leadership to say, how do we rebuild after this has happened? And it's one of those times where I learned a lot from a company and from leaders who were doing it the right way. So this was a chance where we could talk about, okay, you've got to make space for people to talk about how hard this is. You don't have to do it for hours on end. You don't have to do it for weeks and months, but you've got to acknowledge the pain this has brought to people and allow them to express their fears and their anxieties and their sadness, and then also to ask questions. Even if you don't know the answer and you have to say, I don't know right now. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if we're going to have another layoff. But here's what I do know, or here's when I'll have an answer and I can get back to you. And the difference it makes is huge. Because now all of a sudden, instead of worrying about what's happening that I don't know about and whether there's another layoff coming, I can actually focus on my work because I know that I know as much as my boss is able to tell me. And I've had my feelings about this acknowledged and space to talk about it with other people, with my colleagues. And it's a lot easier to turn my attention to what I need to get done. Whereas if you don't do that, productivity goes way down because I'm going to get distracted by all the stuff that I'm wondering about. And, my colleagues and I are going to make up some stories about what we think is going to happen because there isn't any information to go on. And that's how rumors get started and, all of the things that can happen. So there's a lot of turmoil and things in it, but most of all, it's an enormous distraction. That information vacuums are hugely distracting and terrible for productivity.
Well, and it also on a physiological level puts us into this, even if it's just very low key, a stress response.
Absolutely.
Right? And that's not good for any of us to stay in that constantly. So, but you also talk about, so that was very tangible. That's people. We're losing people. They didn't die, but they are gone. They're gone from our daily environment. They are gone. But you and I were talking prior to starting what you are seeing in the workplace now of this, the fallout effect of COVID. I'm just going to leave it at that. Start that conversation. So let's dig into that a little bit about what you're seeing and how that's showing up as however it's showing up.
So it's showing up really with my executive coaching clients is where I'm noticing it most because we have so much interaction. And then also because, as you do with coaching clients, you see them over periods of time. So there's this ebb and flow as different things happen. And it feels as though there's a level of emotional exhaustion that's creeping in now that I haven't noticed before. So that when something happens, that is a problem, right? A key board member leaves, a grant doesn't come in that you expect to come in, that kind of thing. It's harder in a way for folks to find the emotional capacity to deal with it. And I don't have any data on this. I'm just kind of watching it at this point. But I do wonder how much of this is the way in which we powered through the days of the pandemic. And when I say COVID, I don't mean so much the loss that COVID induced, but the way in which nonprofits in particular were called on to continue to serve the people that they serve and figure out how to do it remotely. Right? Moving to Zoom or actually having to go out in the world where we didn't know how contagious it was, whether or not we would get sick, but you need to get out and make sure people have food, for example, or whatever it is. That I just think we never really paused long enough to recover from that. We went right back to, where we are right now, and we're all kind of just as busy as we used to be before COVID. And we are using Zoom, so maybe we're not quite out on the road or traveling quite as much, and we're a little bit more efficient maybe. But we never kind of took a deep breath and said, wow, that was really hard. what we went through. And maybe we need a little downtime and a little recovery time from that. We've just kind of gone back to what people call the new normal, or, where we are now. And I'm seeing just these signs of fatigue and overwhelm in folks that I haven't seen for a while.
So for me, and I was amazed. I mean, businesses said, oh, I don't know how we're going to do remote and stuff. Nonprofits said, okay, we're going to be remote. I mean, it wasn't like we don't know how, we have to, right?
Right. We're going to figure it out.
Right. And so they did, like you were saying, just immediately they were figuring it out. They were following all of the guidelines they could that they knew about at the time. I also know I've had very personal conversations with executives who said, well, now that I'm working from home and I don't have the drive time, I feel like I need to be available. So they would be on Zoom calls before they would have ever been on Zoom calls before, right? Now they could be on them early because the East Coast people they work with or whatever. And I mean, I'm meeting with folks at noon on Zoom and they are exhausted. And I said, so what time's your day start today? Well, I had my first call at 6:30. I'm thinking, never, ever over the decade or more that I've known you, have we gotten on a call that early, ever, So I said, well, why do you do that? Well, I'm up. I've had a cup of coffee. I feel I should be available. Well, you think about that, and that because I'm better off in this moment. So it's that whole kind of juggling thing. And you're right. But I do think when we pulled back, I don't think, number one, of acknowledging that, right? I think that behavior didn't get reined in either. So that it's like, okay, I'm available. But I also know they were dealing with their staff, who many of which got ill or had parents or kids. I mean, so it's you dealing with the community, but their community are their staff as well. That's their family too. So it's like, that's a heavy load to put on you as an individual without, like you're saying, pausing and saying, this is, it's unsustainable, right? I mean, in the most basic word, it's unsustainable to work at that stress level ongoing without expecting to have a fallout or time to grieve or how process. That's why I was so interested in how you're helping people do that now, because it more than the disease of COVID itself, that pandemic, just the urgency of it, and we already have fast lives.
Exactly. Well, and I was listening to your most recent episode yesterday or the day before, and you were talking a bit about this with your guest about these boundaries. And, that's a big way an important way to address it, because my mentor of 25 years likes to say, I don't have a professional life and a personal life. I have a life. And that's true of all of us, right? So there's a beauty to the blending that has gone on with COVID, because for me, for example, we have a dog, as I shared with you, who's a bouncy black lab of 18 months. She's got to get out for a walk. And so I don't start at the crack of dawn. I'm up and I'm out, and I'm maybe working in the sense of I'm thinking about things while I'm out with her, but we're out on our walk, right? And I might work later in the day as a result of that. But what happens is that we impose our schedules on other people. So one of the things that made me think of, it's really common, is a lot of my clients, the executive director or CEO, is getting calls from their board chair at 7:30 or 8 o'clock at night, because their way of, kind of flexing their schedule now is to work late in the evening. And it doesn't mean they've been working since 5:30. They may well have taken 2 hours off to go to the gym or do something else that they like to do. And now they're working in the evening. But the problem is that the client has started at 8, 7 in the morning, and now we're way past, a normal work day. And some of that, which they've had to do, is simply to say to the person, after this time, I am not available. And you can send the email and I'll reply to it first thing in the morning, but, I'm certainly not available to take a phone call about this. That isn't this thing that is not an emergency that you've decided to call me about at 7:30 at night.
Someone's bleeding. Do we need to get them to the hospital? Then call 911. I'm not your first call.
Exactly.
So, I know. But it's hard sometimes, especially it just depends on your relationships, the patterns you've established, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes setting boundaries almost always it's uncomfortable if you've not done it before. And you just have to go, I'm not gonna concave, right? I'm gonna do it and see what happens. like you said, we all make mistakes. Sometimes we're smoother than others.
I know, exactly.
I set
Exactly.
some boundaries that someone has come back and just come right. What? I'm thinking, be quiet, Sarah. Listen to what they say. It's how they feel. It's all okay. You don't have to fix it.
Exactly.
But
Well,
you
and I think the other thing too that has changed, which I now do as well, to kind of get out in front of that is I've been doing more coaching with my clients around when your new board chair comes in. Let's have a conversation about communication expectations.
Yes.
How do you like to communicate? Because the other thing too is like the world is multiplied, right? It's like there was an article somewhere recently, I can't remember if it was the Times or Wall Street Journal somewhere, about the sheer numbers of communication channels, right? So you've got Slack and texting and all these different email and all the things, right? And so, I'm busy sending a note to my board chair on Slack, and meanwhile they're texting me or emailing me. And I do think that sometimes talking about some of this stuff up front, you can prevent there from being some of these issues by chatting about it.
Always talking up front, because, right, it's like, how are you used? Someone's coming from an industry where all they use is Slack. Mm-hmm. They just think that's the norm. Right. People send me stuff all the time. I'm going, if you want me to retain it, if you want the fastest response, please email me, because now I have your email. If you've got a signature line, I should have some phone number to connect with you on if I need to. Right. It's like, how can we make it simple? And honestly, if they can't do that, I will accommodate, especially if we're working together. But I always think having those conversations is important. And then people go, oh, well, that was easy. Now I can model that somewhere else. Yeah, it's communication and expectation setting up front saves a whole bunch of trouble down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, so what I do want to know, when you talk about compassionate workspaces, some of the folks I've talked to in the past may think, for good or ill, they may think that just means people sitting around and going, oh, that's just so bad, or this or that. What if I was to say to you, Margo, help me make sure I have a compassionate workspace? What are some of the identifiers that I might go, okay, I could evaluate whether I had one if I was able to see A, B, C, D. Are you able to do that for me?
So I think one of the biggest ones go back to communication, like we were talking about earlier, right? So let's take the example in this case of an employee who's lost a loved one, right? A spouse, a child, a parent who's a younger, actually really any age, but it's particularly painful if that parent is much younger than the age you expect to lose a parent, right? And so they're coming back to work. So there's in a compassionate workplace, there is more than just the upfront response. Most organizations are pretty good about providing whatever compassionate leave they have in their policy. They will send flowers, they will arrange for meals, they might make a contribution if it's appropriate to a nonprofit, or if there's children involved, say, and the spouse has died, to a scholarship fund. They will go to a service, a celebration of life, whatever is held. And then so often what happens is that's where the communication ends. So the employee comes back to work, and very often what I hear is nobody said a word, right? And all these people showed up to send cards and express their condolences, and then it's as if this loss hasn't happened because nobody's talking about it, right? So to me, that compassion shows up first and foremost in the manager of that employee, because there's a conversation to be had about how you want to come back to work. So, right, if you use me as an example, as you know, we lost our oldest son to brain cancer when he was 21. So if I were going back, not to my own practice, but to a company or a nonprofit, what I would want is my boss to reach out and say, essentially, help us support you. Do you want to talk about Jimmy and what's happened when you come back to work? Or do you see work as the place where you want to be away from that and not thinking about that to the extent you can, and you'd prefer that we don't bring it up? So I'm looking to the person who's had the loss to tell me what they need, right? Do you need some flexibility about when you start in the morning. Maybe you have a surviving child you need to get to school. Maybe sleep is hard and it's tough to get to work at 8:30 or 9, whether, you're in Zoom or in person, but I can work later. So there's this whole conversation to be had, right, about initial needs. And then that informs what that leader then shares with the rest of the team. Because that way, if you know, Sarah, as my colleague, that I want to hear Jimmy's name, and that even though it's going to be scary and uncomfortable for you maybe to say something, you're much more likely to say, gosh, I'm so sorry about Jimmy to me. Because you know that I welcome that and I want to hear that. And you're prepared to do it because you've been given permission by me, essentially, through the conversation I've had with my boss. And so that kind of guidance is critical. And that's why managers play such a huge role in this, because they are the ones that are really facilitating so much of that conversation. And that to me is what that compassion looks like. It's communication. We're going to get it wrong, right? I'm going to be walking into a big presentation and somebody's going to pull me aside and bring up something about the death of my son, and I'm going to cry, and now I got to go do a presentation, right? It's going to go wrong at different times, but it is so much better than the alternative. Because what I hear over and over again from folks is that it's the silence that's deadly. That's what just really devastates people, is when there is no space at all to talk about it. And they don't, it's not the thing that too, I think that I'll just add, managers and colleagues get worried about is that, okay, if I open the door, that's all Margo's going to want to talk about. And you know what? It's not, because we can't sit in that kind of pain for 8 hours a day, right? So if it's enough to bring it up, the chances are that this is going to become an extended conversation are pretty low in the workplace. It's just that acknowledging that we need, based on the way that we need it.
Yeah. Well, and that's occurred a few times in my career where I've had similar conversations where someone's just like frazzled, but they're only talking to me, not their colleagues. And I go, okay, so here's my gift to you. This is a safe space. How do you want this to be? So show up, do what you need to do for work, do or don't talk about it. But I do think it's that invitation to not be invisible.
Yeah.
Right. And talk about like the pandemic where we were cut off from some of that. Even though you're on Zoom, it's different. For me, it's different than being in the room with someone that I can actually feel their energy shift. Because we can put a mask on and withdraw. Right. But if you're next to someone, you can feel when their energy's withdrawn. You're going, they are in deep pain right now. You don't have to address it then, but you might want to talk about it on the side and go, hey, was that hard for you?
Yeah, exactly. Well, and the thing is, if you open that door for that kind of communication, you increase the chances that when that employee is struggling, they will come to you and they will say, it's hard right now. And they may not even know why, or they may, but then you can address it. And too often, I think in workplaces, it's not about not being compassionate. They're a little oblivious sometimes. It's sort of like, if I don't hear about it, everything must be okay. Oh, Margo hasn't been crying lately at work. She must be better now. You have to be careful about assuming that what you don't know is the truth of things, right? You want enough communication so that really do know what's happening at work and with the humans that are working for you.
Yeah. Our humans, we are not as strong as we like people to think we are. We are fallible, and we all need our pals sometimes to lift us up.
Yeah.
And it's not
Absolutely.
forever. It's not forever. And I think when you are in grief, it feels like it's forever. It won't stop. And that you must be the only person who feels like they're falling apart.
Yeah, exactly.
Everybody else looks good.
Exactly. Exactly. But it's funny. My mother said to me a lot of years ago, she's now passed away, but I remember her saying what's in the context of someone that I knew that was having a lot of mental health struggles. She was asking, well, does he have a job? Is he able to go to work? And I said, yes, he is. I've no insight into how it's going, but he is. And she said, well, that's a good sign, right? If you can get up and take a shower and go to work, that in of itself is healing. It's good to be able to do that. And so I think, when any of us are grieving, we also want some normalcy. We want to be functioning in the world too. And so we come back to work wanting to do our best most of the time and wanting to be productive. So we just need a little extra help.
And it also, the one thing I would offer to folks who are worried about if they open themselves up to ask those questions that they have to fix whatever's happening is you do not. You are just being open and learning. And if it's something that if it's a policy thing that you can fix or something like that, do it. But if it's someone who needs help beyond what you can offer, then, help them get connected up to someone who can help, someone who is in a position to help, whether it's a therapist or whatever. It might be a medical doctor if things are going off for them physically. But just be brave enough to say, yeah, that really sucks. Have you considered, or how's it going on this? Let me help you find someone. And in the human resources context, that's what we do. We help people get what they need. We aren't the fixers. We're not the doctors, the therapists, all of that. So
exactly. Well, and also too, to remember that so often the power is in being given permission to ask. That even if you have to say, no, I'm sorry, we can't accommodate that, right? We're a small business. We're a small nonprofit. We don't have the flexibility to be able to make that happen for you. There's tremendous power in that person being able to ask and then being given a thoughtful answer as to why that request can't be honored.
Yep. And I always think about at this time, because, you may have never as a business been asked to respond to that request. And maybe at this moment in time, it's financially or whatever, not possible. But it may open the door to talk to the team about, if this comes up in the future, how might we want to handle this? How could we, in a way that we're not in it? Sometimes it requires people doing new restructuring, like on vacation policies, whatever. It might be an opportunity to see what's missing that you have, just like going on a board, see what's out there that you don't know about. There may be things out there around in your community that could help you help your folks. So, it is kind of a big old circle, staying open and being curious. So I know you have something you offer our listeners on your website. So can you share a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So in the resources section, there are 6 or 7 downloadable PDFs about different aspects of dealing with grief in the workplace. So there's one, for example, for a leader who's going through their own grief, how to navigate grief at work while continuing to lead. And there are also PDFs for someone who's grieving and returning to work, and someone who has a colleague who's grieving and wants to be supportive.
Sweet. Okay, so we're signing off of the podcast right now, Margo. Where do you want to leave folks as a last thought, or probably not the last thought, because we could have this conversation again, but a parting thought to help them maybe think differently about how they're showing up at work in a way that expands everybody's well-being?
I've been thinking a little bit about this because I know you like to ask this question. I've listened to a lot of your other episodes. And the thing that I keep coming back to, and I hope this language is okay to use on your podcast, but I keep going back to my first boss out of college, who was absolutely the best boss I ever had, because he really believed in his people, and he could see things in them before we could see them ourselves, and would push in a really appropriate way for us to take chances. And one of his many sayings was, you need to live with your ass on the line, which I hope is okay to say on the podcast.
Absolutely.
Okay. And I've always loved that. And he's another one where he had a really profound influence on my life, because he just felt like it was so important to take chances and say yes to things, that was how you learned not just what you were capable of, but maybe what you couldn't do or didn't want to do, but that it was important to take chances and learn from them. And that's really how I built my business, was continuing to just say yes to things, and sometimes finding out, wow, I'm not that good at that, and I'm not going to do that again. Or I really didn't enjoy that, I'm not going to do it again. But I have found so many other things that I love doing that when I first started, I couldn't imagine I would be doing. But just slowly but surely, as people offered me opportunities to try something new, I would say yes, and discover either that I loved it or that I was good at it, or both.
Okay, so here's my challenge to all of our podcast listeners. Go into the comments on this episode with Margo Fowkes and myself, either on the podcast player you're listening to or on YouTube in our channel, and tell us where you've taken a chance or said yes to something and you have expanded as a result of it, or conversely, you've thought, that was one and done. Glad I did it. Done.
I know.
We would love to learn what you guys take away from this. So do that. We'll be watching in the comments. And for all of you, I wish you all the best in your communications with your friends, families, and colleagues. Feel free to reach out to Margo. We both put out in there that if you were curious about getting on a board and had some questions, we'd love to talk to you about it. Those were sincere. All the connection things for Margo will be in the show notes. And same for me. So have a great rest of your day, and we will see you.
You've been listening to the No Labels, No Limits podcast with best-selling author, change agent, and strategic business coach, Sarah Boxx. You can grab the show notes and find out how to work with Sarah at sarahboxx.com/No Labels, No Limits podcast. We'd love this podcast to reach as many people as possible. Please remember to rate, leave a 5-star review, and share the podcast with someone you think would get value from this conversation. Till next time, keep taking those daily action steps to align your purpose to your principles and achieve your goals in business and life.